Okay. I think we are good, Jeff.
Okay, all right. Mr. Patton, we're on agenda item number 3, Priest Lake Modification Project.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. You just heard a briefing by your attorneys recommending that you commence litigation. And so at this point, we'd be asking for a vote on that matter.
Okay, is there a motion from the board?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I would move that we authorize legal counsel to pursue a lawsuit against the bond issuer for Strider, which is Travelers, for recovery of the amounts due to the board as a result of as a result of Strider's breach of the contract.
Okay, I have a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, we will proceed to vote. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. Mr. Patton, you'll instruct legal counsel?
Yes, sir, I will.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Next.
Next, we will continue on with the Priest Lake Dam Modification Project. And I'm going to turn the time over to Mike Morrison to discuss moving forward with a new contractor and authorizing funds for that work. Yeah, do I need to turn my video on? I don't think so. I think you're fine.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, board members, as promised in the July board meeting, today I will be presenting a resolution to approve funding for completion of the Priest Lake Outlet Dam Improvements Project during the 2023-2024 construction season. And I think the resolution is up there on the screen. I think Jennifer's put it up there for us. Now, before I introduce the resolution, I'd like to start with a brief recapitulation of funds already expended and committed to the project. To date, the board has approved $5.95 million for studies, engineering, construction management, and construction of 2 projects at Priest Lake, the Thoroughfare Improvements Project and the Outlet Dam Improvements Project. The Thoroughfare Improvement Project was completed satisfactorily in August of 2021 for a total cost of about $2.1 million from that $5.95 million. So you're likely aware that the Outlet Dam Improvements Project has not gone quite as smoothly as the Thoroughfare Project. And although some $1.95 million was committed to its construction, only about $1.2 million of that has actually been dispersed to the contractor at this time. So including the $500,000 that the board has already approved for engineering and construction management for the next season, that is through project completion, the entire cost of the Priest Lake project, Priest Lake Outlet Dam to date has been $3.1 million. So any questions about that before I move on?
Questions?
Yeah, would you repeat the amount we've spent to date? Is that just on the contract or does that include the engineering?
The $3.1 million includes the previous contractor, all of the engineering that has been done. It includes engineering and construction management through April of 2024. But it doesn't include money for the contractor that I'm going to ask you for today.
So how much has been paid to Strider?
It comes out to about 1.2 million.
We have $2 million in additional costs.
We've got costs for engineering, construction management, and then we had to go back and redo a whole bunch of it after Strider got done. We had to go through and do an investigation to go find out what needed to be replaced. But yes, you're correct, sir.
Thank you.
Further questions? Okay, I think we can continue.
Okay. So over the past few months, the board has engaged in a two-step process to identify and select a qualified contractor to complete the work started by the previous contractor. The first step, previous qualification, was a thorough review of the company's capabilities and experience, paying particular attention to the qualifications of key individuals who will be working on the outlet dam project. The evaluation committee found 2 companies to be qualified to do the work and invited both companies to bid. Both companies appear to be well qualified to do the project. However, one company, North Bank Civil and Marine, submitted a slightly lower bid than the other company. Their bid was for $4,355,000. Any questions about that?
What was the other bid? This is Mark Gibbs. What was the other bid?
The other bid was from Cyblon Reed, and it was for about $160,000 more. So right about $4.41 million.
Thank you.
So North Bank's bid is going to include all work not completed by the previous contractor. That includes replacing the 11 Tainter gate J seals, extension of a portion of the concrete apron below the dam that wasn't completed by the previous contractor, placement of additional armor stone not completed by the additional contractor, and various minor improvements and repairs that either were not completed by the previous contractor or repairs to things that were caused by the previous contractor. The work will be substantially complete by April 1st, 2024. So staff requests that the board consider approval of the attached resolution authorizing expenditure of up to $4.5 million from the water management account to defray the costs of construction and to provide a small contingency fund. And I would imagine you've got questions for me.
Questions for Mike?
Mr. Chair, this is Joanne.
Go ahead.
I have a question for Mike. Mike, is there any type of plan for if they don't finish by April 2024? Is there a penalty or an incentive?
Yes, ma'am. There is a penalty that's built into the contract. It's liquidated damages that are built into it. About $2,500 per day.
And Mr. Chairman, Mike, we have enough money in the other authorization to cover the construction management of this project, or is that going to be an additional amount?
The board approved sufficient money for funds for all of the construction management that we're going to need through the end of the project during the July board meeting. It was $500,000.
Mr. Chairman, Mike, I've got a question, Brian O.
Go ahead.
Mike, what is there going to be a full cofferdam required, or are they going to work, they can do this work cofferdam only part of it at a time, or what's the plan on that? I don't need you to get into the weeds a long ways, but just curious on how they're going to get all the work done with, with water in.
Mr. Olmstead, Mr. Chair, this is one of the main drivers for the cost for this project. They are planning a full bypass system. Looks kind of like flumes that are going to divert the water quite a ways downstream. I don't have all of the details from the contractor yet on their, we're going to have a meeting here fairly soon as we've got a contract with them to go over all of the details of it. But essentially it's going to be a bypass system and a cofferdam system. And that actually, I would like to point out, the bid included almost $1.9 million for the cofferdam system, which is actually about the same price that the previous contractor bid on the entire project. So they're spending a lot of money on the dewatering system that the previous contractor had planned to spend. And that is a major driver of the increased cost here.
That sounds like a good buy to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Olmstead.
Any other questions? Okay. We need to review the resolution then, or where are we at, Brian?
You have a resolution on screen. So the resolution authorizes the expenditure of the $4.5 million from the water management account, and authorizes entering into the agreements. With that, you have a resolution in front of you for action.
Okay, are there any questions on this resolution? The chair would entertain a motion to adopt.
Mr. Chair, this is Board Member Cole-Hansen. I move that we adopt this resolution.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second. This is Dale.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion on the resolution? Hearing none, we will proceed to vote by roll call. Jennifer, please.
Mr. Barker,
Aye.
Ms. Cole-Hansen,
Aye.
Mr. Gibbs,
Aye.
Mr. McMahon,
Aye.
Mr. Olmstead,
Aye.
Mr. Stevenson,
Aye.
Mr. Van Stone,
Aye.
and Chairman Raybould.
Aye. Okay, it appears the motion has carried. Any further business regarding Priest Lake, Brian?
No, that takes care of it for today, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your consideration of this.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is UIC rulemaking. Who gets to do
Yes,
that?
I'm gonna turn this over to Eric Bowe. He is the section manager over our groundwater protection section here at IDWR. And he's going to give you a briefing and an update on the status of the underground injection control rulemaking. This is being undertaken as part of the zero-based rulemaking effort directed by the governor.
Okay, welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Just loading up our little PowerPoint I put together real quick. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Today I'll be updating the board on a fairly recent issue the UIC program has been working through during the current rulemaking process. And that is the injection of recycled municipal and industrial wastewater into Idaho's aquifers. First, I'll start off with a little background. So interest in injecting recycled municipal and industrial wastewater into Idaho's underground source drinking water aquifers has developed over the last year and is increasing. Largely, it appears to be due to increasing federal regulations on things like NPDES permits, and then also the growing populations. This has driven folks to seek additional options in lieu of a typical land application, rapid infiltration, or discharge to a river process. Another thing that's been occurring that we're seeing is declining water supplies driving this. A couple proposed applications are regarding recharge for declining aquifer systems, along with water right mitigation. Take a step back and we'll look at the current regulations that we have in place. So for IDWR, IDAPA 370303 establishes the minimum standards and criteria for injection of fluids into Class 5 injection wells. This is a primacy program under the EPA. Really, the intent of this is to protect Idaho's valuable groundwater resources, recognizing that underground source drinking water aquifers provide greater than 92% of the state's potable drinking water supply. From DEQ, Some other related rule sets. IDAPA 580108 regulates public drinking water systems. This is based on 40 CFR Part 141 and 143, which corresponds to the EPA drinking water standards and their rules. The intent here, obviously, is to ensure Idaho's public water systems provide safe, potable drinking water that's free of contamination. And then finally, we have IDAPA from DEQ's rule set. We have IDAPA 580117 that regulates recycled water in Idaho. The intent here is to ensure recycled municipal and industrial wastewater is treated and applied in a manner that doesn't impact our USDWs. Generally speaking, this is limited to land application, rapid infiltration basins, and discharge to rivers, all of which have substantial environmental buffers when that water eventually were to migrate to USDW. So when this came up, a couple questions came to mind initially. First off is what are the implications of injecting treated municipal and industrial wastewater into Idaho's aquifers? You know, related to that, you recognize that the injectate is an atypical source of water. It's not a natural source like a river or a lake. Likely contains contaminants listed in EPA's drinking water standards, of which there's, I believe, 90. But then also likely contains non-regulated contaminants called contaminants of emerging concern that aren't typically observed in natural sources of water. Additionally, in a lot of these situations with injection, there's going to be a limited environmental buffer. The time it takes this water to get to a USDW could be incredibly short. And when we look at it, really there's implications between looking at a shallow injection well and a deep injection well. They're fundamentally different. We'll talk about that a bit later. And so finally, what it comes down to is when processing these applications, how do we ensure that Idaho's USDWs are adequately protected from contamination is what we're looking at. And first, we'll cover some basic criteria and information necessary to assess this. First off, there's the standards of quality for potable drinking water. EPA drinking water standards, the primary standards, again, there's around 90 of them, are based on known or anticipated, what is known or anticipated to occur in public water systems. They're developed for typical, relatively uncontaminated natural sources of fresh water. So again, think of groundwater, rivers, reservoirs. And one of the evaluation criteria that they look at, one of three that I found, was whether a contaminant is found or substantially likely to be found in a public water system with a frequency and at levels of concern. As far as contaminants of emerging concern, atypical sources of water, such as municipal and industrial wastewater, can contain any number, as you imagine, any number of thousands of CECs, contaminants of emerging concern, that aren't present in natural sources. Some of the examples from the literature I looked at was proprietary industrial chemicals, unidentified halogenated compounds, pharmaceuticals, synthetic hormones, and then certain pathogens. And overall, this makes it very difficult to regulate. Just deciding on what analytes to focus on, what contaminants to focus on, and then what concentrations are harmful. As far as national regulations for reuse, EPA's taken a hands-off approach and encouraging states to develop appropriate regulation. Really, they break the reuse down into two different types. The first of which is going to be indirect potable reuse, which introduces, and I have purified in quotes, I'll get to what that kind of means in a subsequent slide, which introduces purified recycled water into an environmental buffer. So think of groundwater, aquifer, or surface water reservoir, lake, river, before the blended water is introduced into a water supply system. So you apply it, it'll gradually infiltrate into a USDW prior to being diverted in a public water system. So there's an environmental buffer in place. Whereas direct potable reuse, or DPR, introduces purified recycled water directly into the existing supply system. So that's straight from the facility, treatment facility, to the faucet. And this information is documented on EPA's website in a document titled Potable Reuse Compendium in 2017. And this has a lot of the information for states to consider when addressing this issue or looking into this issue. Real quick, just because it's recognized that there's a lot of other, contaminants of emerging concern in this water when it's treated. So prior to either doing the IPR or the DPR, there's a water purification process. So that's that purified term for purified potable drinking water. It goes above and beyond what you typically might do in a community water system. And this is a basic step. This is from Arizona. They're working on their regulation for it right now. Fairly decent explanation of it, but it's a multi-step filtration process. So you might have the effluent coming from a typical treatment facility that might treat it from a class A or E standard, or E to A standard. Then it goes into what really is like an ultra purification system, where they do ultrafiltration, potentially reverse osmosis, UV, activated carbon, and then a chlorine disinfection. These may vary a little bit depending on if it's IPR or DPR. Obviously, the direct potable reuse needs to be treated to a little bit higher standards before folks drink it. This is kind of just a diagram. Also, this is from IWRB. This would be a diagram essentially for the indirect potable reuse, where you have a treatment facility that essentially puts it straight into a source, surface water or groundwater, and then it's pumped from pump stations for community systems, and then cycles through the system in that extent. Whereas a direct potable reuse, you have your, basically it goes from the drinking water treatment facility directly to the community. And so it has to be treated at pretty high standards for that. Looking at it nationally, this is the most current list I could kind of find or picture from, this was from IWRB, working with the EPA. This states in blue are states that have regulations or at least guidelines in place on how to manage this issue. I think Arizona can be added to it because I got some of the information from them. I know they're working on it as well. So for the current UIC rules, there's no specific rule that addresses the injection of recycled municipal or industrial wastewater. Reading through the rules, in particular, IDAPA 37, 03, 03, 04, 02, B, and C, they broadly grant the director or authorize the director to protect groundwater resources from contamination. And working under that, we can add additional requirements necessary potentially if we get an application in. But we're trying to work, since the timing with the rulemaking process, we're trying to modify our current rules accordingly or appropriately. And then in our original rule set, another rule that we used, Rule 7005 CI6. This is one, it states that at no time shall any fluid containing or suspected of containing fecal contaminants of human origin be injected into any Class 5 injection well authorized under these rules. This is something that historically we've used to deny folks or discourage folks from wanting to inject treated municipal wastewater because at some point it could be suspected of containing. It was kind of how it was, how we applied this rule in practice. But again, this is just for municipal wastewater, not industrial. And then we did receive a lot of feedback during the rulemaking process related to this rule as being too restrictive, especially during certain nuanced situations that I can talk about here in a second. So for the proposed rules to capture this new issue, under the definition section in Rule 10, we added definitions for industrial wastewater, municipal wastewater, recycled water, and wastewater. These definitions were are exactly the same as what's seen in the recycled water program at DEQ. But Rule 35, we added permit requirements for these situations for both deep injection wells and shallow injection wells. And then we also noted in here that applications proposing to inject recycled reuse water must also adhere to the DEQ recycled water rules, IDAPA 580117. And again, this is both for deep and shallow wells. With regards to the previous rule that I talked in our current, the fecal rule, we did end up modifying this a little bit. Oops. Based on feedback. Since we're adding a section that specifically addresses the standards of quality for recycled municipal water, we felt like we could open up a little bit more freedom in this rule. And basically we struck the part about being suspected of containing, and then added an additional line regarding subsurface fluid distribution systems that apply recycled discharge water. There's kind of a little overlap when DEQ, during their recycled water permitting process, they have a land application process. And we had the city of Middleton propose a similar process, but it was a gravity-fed irrigation, which unfortunately met the definition of an injection well according to EPA, and we're bound by their rules. So in any event, this just allows freedom for systems that are very similar to a land application process to exist. Then in Rule 5506, and this is where we added a rule regulating standards of quality for the injectate. And we did these for both deep and shallow. And I think in the next slide, I'll kind of discuss why that is. For the shallow injection wells, we just made sure to note that the recycled water must meet or exceed the groundwater quality standards in IDAPA 580111, and then also comply with the recycled water rules prior to injecting into a shallow injection well. So this made sense to all the folks participating in the rulemaking process. Shallow injection isn't much different than a land application or rapid infiltration basin. It's still saturating the same geologic unit, and you still have that substantial environmental buffer it has to go through before it gets to a USDW. So that rule made sense.
Hey,
However,
this is Jeff, just a thought, and maybe you covered it and I missed it. Do you have a definition for what shallow and what deep is? Is it based on the geologic formation where you're at, or is it 0 to 20 feet deep? And or how do I know whether I've got a shallow injection well or a deep one?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's a great question. Shallow injection wells are wells constructed to a depth of less than or equal to 18 feet, and deep injection wells are greater than 18 feet. So we didn't differentiate by geologic units. In this case, we broke it down. In the UIC world, we really look at these two different classes of injection wells, and so we left it in here. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I just wondered. Thank you.
In any event, so with the deep injection wells, because the concern here is that, for example, we received proposals or questions about injecting directly into a USDW. And if you imagine doing that, there's really not much of an environmental buffer between that and a community water system. Not like you would see with, say, a shallow injection well. So in this case, what we ended up adding, we have the same rule as far as like a shallow injection well, but then additionally, we wanted to make sure that folks proposing these practices would not degrade the USDWs. So we added the language, additionally, the concentration of each contaminant in the injected fluids shall not exceed the background concentration of each contaminant in receiving water likely to reach a USDW. Then we went on to add just to try to avoid some ambiguity and recognize there'll be some analysis associated with this and measurable contamination. We noted that a background concentration of any applicable contaminant shall be determined by statistical analysis consisting of the type and method approved by the department. So we essentially raised the bar if folks want to inject directly into the same coarse sand or gravel unit that the community systems are pulling from because of that lack of environmental buffer. This is a slide. It was for a presentation for the well drillers in Idaho for continuing education. It was actually pretty relevant. In any event, what we're looking at here, again, lithologies are different across Idaho. In this case, we have a public water system well here, and we have a couple injection wells. Here's a shallow one and a deep one to the right. The lithology here this is more the Treasure Valley example. So you have your interbedded sand, silts, and clays. The blue area, along with the colors, are all the saturated ground and whatnot. So for this public water system, this well is constructed down, so it's pulling from these lower sand and gravel units down in here. The implications from what some of the proposals that we're receiving is, we have both some that classify as a shallow injection well and some that classify as a deep injection well. The shallow injection well is going to inject that water, like we talked about, into wells that are less than or equal to 18 foot in depth. So that upper unit, usually unconfined, there's usually quite a bit of contamination there to begin with, in all honesty, especially with all the septic systems in Idaho. And so that unit can be treated. The process of injecting water in a shallow injection well, it seems reasonable that it could be treated similar to a land application process or a rapid infiltration basin. It's all saturated in this upper unit, and we construct wells in Idaho to hopefully seal out that upper unit, and that protects or mitigates from that concern, allowing a really long environmental buffer time for this water to ever reach the production zones for a public water system or the USDWs. Whereas if you have a deep injection well, potentially, and this is based on proposals that we've had folks talk with us about, injecting it, if you inject treated municipal wastewater into a deep water bearing unit that's used by a public water system, the environmental buffer is just this sand and gravel aquifer, and that's not much of an environmental buffer. The argument is there for dilution, but as far as like a buffer per se, there's not a lot there aside from the dilution aspect. That's about it as far as a background of the issue. As far as next steps, just so Mr. Chairman and the board are aware, we're meeting with the DEQ executive team tomorrow, actually, on the 17th, to discuss this issue. Plan on reviewing our draft rules and develop a strategy. Obviously, when it comes to making determinations and analyzing wastewater treatment facilities and what we need to treat wastewater, to what degree we should be treating wastewater, that's where a lot of their expertise with environmental engineers could come into play. And so that's what we're going to discuss with them. And then following that meeting, I plan on holding an internal meeting just to discuss the status of this draft rule and then determine a timeline going forward. With that, I'll open it up to questions.
Okay, any questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Go ahead.
Eric, I apologize that this is kind of out of the time zone we're talking, but given the significant impact of potential PFAS elimination in water systems, would it be treated differently, the presence of PFAS in your injected water? Or is that too far out to ask?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. McMahon, yes, I'm familiar with the PFAS issue. My understanding is currently PFAS is considered still a contaminant of emerging concern. It's not officially on EPA's list, but there is a lot of effort in a lot of municipalities. From my exposure with working with the Treasure Valley water purveyors, the local municipalities and water providers in the Treasure Valley here in South Idaho. There is they're receiving a lot of funding to kind of look into and begin measurements to figure out how much PFAS we actually have in the systems right now. But there's no regulation in place that governs that. Right now, I know they're trying to sort out what level is harmful to public health, and then what level can we actually measure. There's certainly some challenges associated with that. And down the road, that will be a real issue that we'll be working through. But again, that leads, I think that's why a lot of the states who are working on this reuse issue have been doing this quote unquote purified water method, for lack of a better term, meaning they're treating it to much higher standards using very sophisticated equipment to treat that water to make sure that a lot of the contaminants are out. And I think just by using that treatment method, I think my understanding is that PFAS gets cleaned up in it. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Other questions?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to follow up on that, if I may.
Go ahead.
So are we going to require testing for these emergent contaminants of concern before we say, okay, go ahead and discharge? And if we're not, we run the risk of having PFAS injected into the deep aquifers. And as I understand it, this stuff doesn't break down at all. So there's a risk of even injecting it into the shallow aquifers. But if we're not testing for it, and it's hard to test for, as I understand, you got to go to parts per trillion or something like that. And that EPA has said that there are no safe exposure levels for this stuff. I mean, it seems like we're putting our drinking water at risk.
That's a great question, Mr. Barker, and a valid concern. The PFAS issue is going to be, it's going to be really interesting how that progresses down the road. It's certainly going to be impactful to a lot of communities. As far as the requirement to treat it, yeah. As far as the requirement to the point you got to was essentially the challenging aspect of this whole situation, and that is that municipal wastewater systems put out a fluid that's probably fairly consistent from system to system. Industrial wastewater systems could be quite a bit different depending on what the manufacturing site is. And when you look at all these factors, any one of these wastewater systems can have thousands of different contaminants in there. And so the question comes up is, well, what do we test for? Is it reasonable to have somebody test for 2,000 different analytes? And so I think what DEQ does in these situations, and we probably do as well, is they do a preliminary application meeting, I think they call it, in their rules, where they meet with the applicant, discuss what the injectate is, what it originates from, and then discuss what analytes, what contaminants might be present in it, and then collectively generate a list of what we should be looking for. A lot of times when you implement these DPR, so for these injection practices, first off, I'll say that the reason we're trying to get these rules in place or just get some guidance in place is phone calls that I've had everything from folks wanting to treat this to DPR levels. So they're concerned, they want really good quality water to go into these aquifers. And so they're wanting to treat it to a very high level of standard that some communities, I don't think it's happening in Idaho quite yet, but they'll essentially drink the treated wastewater. But then I've also had folks interested in injecting Class A wastewater. And so we have that full gamut of conversations that I've had. Again, we haven't received any applications yet. This is just conversations I've had with people and then working on a pilot study locally here. But that is a good question. I don't know the answer as far as what contaminants we'd be looking at.
Al, this is Jeff. I'm just reading this section B of this proposed rule, and it says the background concentration of each contaminant in the receiving water let me start over. Additionally, the concentration of each contaminant in the injected fluid shall not exceed the background concentration of each contaminant in the receiving water that is likely to reach the USDW. So if PFAS, would they have to demonstrate, or if it's just something that I can't remember the term, but if it's not a listed contaminant, if it's just a contaminant of concern, then this rule doesn't protect us from that?
Mr. Chairman,
If I could inject, see, it says the use concentration of a contaminant. Is that identified as just contaminants that are listed by EPA and the state, or does it include these contaminants of concern?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Barker, I don't have the formal definition of contamination in front of me, but it really relates to any contaminant that could potentially cause health issues. It's not just specific to the drinking water standards that EPA has. So all the contaminants of concern would fall under a contaminant. And then, yeah, the intent here was to set a really high bar if somebody really is interested in injecting into a USDW or waters that are hydraulically connected to a USDW, set a very high bar for them to meet before they do it. There's other options like a shallow injection well, which is really no different and honestly probably less efficient than a rapid infiltration basin and land application process, or discharge into the river. So they have that shallow injection well option. I don't know how many people are actually going to pursue a deep injection with this type of rigorous requirement, but it seems necessary right now until we get a better handle on potential for contamination. So that was the intent of that part.
So you also had a change, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I have a similar line of questions that has to do with the fecal coliform. You had a thing that said we're not going to allow discharge. It used to say we're not going to allow discharge if it was suspected of having fecal coliform. Right.
Correct.
And now if we have it, if we suspect it, but we don't know, then they can still inject. And I thought that there wasn't a single NPDES permit that had a provision that said 0 fecal coliform as their obligation. Every one of them has a limit that says no more than so many column or so many populations per milligram, but that doesn't mean none. So is there such a thing as a municipal wastewater treatment plant that doesn't contain fecal contaminants?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Barker, yeah, it's very insightful. Yeah, so the way that was originally phrased, there was no way to meet that bar. You can't completely remove fecal contamination from wastewater 100%. You might, the MPN method, maximum probable number, is based off, I believe 1,000 milliliters or whatever. And so if you were to take a larger sample, it is conceivable that you'd have trace amounts of coliform in there. And so the way it was worded before, that flat out eliminated the conversation about allowing municipal or treated municipal wastewater to be injected as reuse. The reason that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but why doesn't this current version do the same thing? If it's a municipal wastewater, it's going to have some fecal contaminants, because we can't eliminate all of it, you just said. So how can anybody use this statute or this reg, sorry?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Barker, you're correct. So the way this is an original reg, the way it was worded, and it basically prevented allowing municipal injection of municipal reuse. Because we added a section, just to understand why we made these changes real quick, and that is we added a whole section related to injection of municipal and industrial or treated municipal and industrial wastewater. Because of that, we wouldn't need to rely on this rule here, 5504F. This rule here now is really at no time shall any untreated fluid. So in other words, this rule prohibits any untreated. So it hasn't gone through any, it has to be a fluid that hasn't gone through any untreated or any treatment process. That fluid is not allowed to be injected if it was potentially exposed to fecal contaminants. And that's really kind of was the intent here. And then we could add our protections in the standards of quality for municipal and industrial wastewater. At least that was the intent. But this is a challenge that a lot of communities are working on and trying to figure out what is best for them. And it's everything from, I know, places in, I think, Colorado and California, they do the direct potable reuse, meaning people are drinking water treated from the wastewater facility. Those are highly populated areas, a lot of water concerns. They're apparently to that point where that's a necessity. Is that something that needs to be in place here in Idaho right now? That's a question for the board and a question for folks to determine.
So what, Mr. Chairman, Eric, what does it mean to comply with the recycled wastewater rules or recycled water rules? Because there's different classifications of water. And if you have a certain type of wastewater, you can use it on certain types of crops. If you have another type of wastewater, you can use it on crops that are fit for human consumption. And then if you have another type of wastewater, you can actually completely drink it. So if it complies with the standards, what does that mean when you've got different standards for different types of reuse?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Parker, again, that's another good question. I'm not, well, my understanding of the recycled water rules, first off, is it's a rule set for treating water from Class A to Class E standards, Class A being the best. And again, so none of that's for drinking, but that's all in place to allow for, like you say, a land application process for irrigation. It could be, I know City of Meridian, for example, irrigates park lawns with that, and they identify it with the purple pipe and whatnot. And then also there's rapid infiltration basins. So the reason that we reference the recycled water rules, and again, this is a conversation that I hope to have tomorrow with the folks over at DEQ, is I wanted to make sure that I pulled them into the conversation because ultimately this is recycled water. They're wanting to do something different than the intent of the recycled water rules, but it is recycled water. And we, internally, I mean, our program manager for UIC is a professional geologist, not necessarily somebody great at what he does, but not necessarily somebody geared towards assessing treatment processes at a facility. And so DEQ has to my understanding, potentially has some folks with a little more experience related to treatment processes and what might be necessary to treat it to certain standards to protect, a USDW.
Well, it seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that we need to make sure that if we identify anything in the recycled water rules, that we identify what subset that we're going to say is appropriate for discharge into a drinking water aquifer, and another subset that might be appropriate for drinking, in discharging into a shallow aquifer, because it seems to me those are different questions, and that we need to do what we can to protect our drinking water sources.
Well, I certainly agree with that. So let me get an understanding of what kind of a timeline we're under here. We're going to take these for a test drive with DEQ tomorrow. Then you're going to come back and have an additional internal meeting at IDWR after that to refine them further, Eric? And then what is the timeline that we have to put these rules in front of us and I assume approve those as temporary rules, or what do we do next? Who wants to answer that question?
Mr. Chairman, I'll take a swing at it. Yes, it is a tight timeline right now. We unfortunately, I know that DEQ's experienced a lot of challenges with staffing, and so we haven't had the a significant level of involvement to get an understanding of if these make sense. When writing these, we are dragging or just involving DEQ in this, and I want to make sure that they have the resources and talent necessary to accomplish this. And so a lot of this is based on this conversation that we need to have with them. Unfortunately, we couldn't get that meeting scheduled until it's going to occur tomorrow. But that puts us in a very tight timeline. My understanding, I don't have the dates in front of me, but obviously the proposed rule, when it's finalized, would need to be published in the October bulletin. My understanding is that DFM would need to receive a final proposed rule the 1st of September to allow for I think that was the deadline, the 1st of September. So I could be missing another deadline. I would be happy to update the board after I look into this and have internal conversations tomorrow to come up with a timeline. But I think we would need to have a finalized final proposed rule approved by the board by September, by the first week of September.
Okay, follow up to that, Brian, we've got an asterisk on this agenda item that says action may be taking. Was staff proposing that we take an action today, or are we just, is this really just to inform the board of what's going on and get input from the board before this is finalized and then we adopt it?
Mr. Chairman, this presentation was to inform the board about this issue, this recycled water issue, and get input from the board, see where the board is at with this issue before this rule is finalized. We would be probably needing another special board meeting that first week of September once these rules are finalized. In order to get your approval and have you pass a resolution approving them so they can be submitted on to the governor's office.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Board members, do you have any more questions about these proposed rules?
So, Mr. Chairman, I do have one
Yeah.
question about the timeline we're down to a couple weeks to really understand this, and not really haven't gotten the input from DEQ yet on it that I think we need. And I guess I would just wonder how urgent this rulemaking is, and is there a reason we have to propose it this year? Can we hold off for a while? And I don't know. I haven't participated in any of the negotiated rulemaking, so I don't know if everybody out there in the world, from the enviros to the municipalities to the industrial users, are happy as clams with this, or what?
Mr. Chairman, our rules review officer is just walked in the room, so I'm going to ask him to answer that question.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Member Barker. I think the meeting tomorrow with DEQ will be critical to understanding how we should proceed here. When we get their attention, they will have come prepared, I think, and having reviewed the rule. And if they're very comfortable with it, I think we probably can move forward and be comfortable ourselves and try to get this done this year. If they're not, then I think probably this is one that we just need to carry over into the following year, which we can do. The governor's office likely won't like it, but I also don't think they would want us to rush something that's not ready. The real implication that has is that Eric has more rulemaking to do next year. And so we start to put a lot on his plate, but hopefully this wouldn't be something that would carry over for the entirety of next year. We'd get it taken care of early and then just have it waiting for legislative review that following, I guess, in the 2025 session. Does that answer your questions?
It does, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Matt. And I'll just say my comment was we really do need to get these questions about what do we do about these emerging contaminants of concern, and two, how do we deal with this language that says compliance with the DEQ recycled water rules when there's different measures? I mean, what does that exactly mean? I don't understand it. Maybe DEQ does, but it would be helpful to have an explanation from them.
Okay, any other comments? Well, Brian, I think what we need to do then is allow this meeting with DEQ to happen and then get back to us with where DEQ's at as quick as we can, answer some of the questions that have been brought up here today. Maybe get a memo or something out to the board so the board understands what's coming at them when we do, if and when we hold a meeting to approve the rule, these proposed rules. And then the other thing is let's develop a timeline. Let's figure out what the drop dead date of having these submitted to the governor's office is.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we will do that once Eric and crew have a chance to meet with DEQ and then circle the wagons back here and figure out what our path forward is after that meeting. We'll make sure to inform you.
Okay, anything else on this agenda item?
Mr. Chairman, Brian, just one
Yeah.
question I'd like to see answered when we do circle back. Is there already a cut and dried frequency for the testing that would, how frequent the testing would have to be, and is it always a third party that does the testing? Just a little bit of the protocol on testing for this type of injection, because I'm sure they have protocols now for discharging into surface waters or whatever they're doing, but I just haven't seen anything on. Seems like you got to test pretty darn frequently and make sure it's done right for going into an aquifer. So for next time.
Okay, board members, anything else?
Nothing here.
Okay, the next agenda item is non-action items for discussion. Do any board members have anything to bring up at this time? Okay, I will just report that Roger Chase called me this morning. He'd heard that Director Smackman was retiring and was being replaced by this Matt Weaver fellow, and wanted to make sure that was all going to be okay with the water board. And I told him I thought it would be just fine. He sounded good and continues to be interested in what we're up to as a board. So with that, Mr. Patton, next meeting?
Next meeting is, oh yes, we have a cloud seeding committee meeting on September 6th. And then after that, you have your regularly scheduled meeting in Salmon later that month in September.
Okay, and probably another special meeting in early September to decide what to do with these proposed rules.
Correct. We will try and piggyback it on the 6th if we can,
Okay.
if the schedules for those two things line up.
Okay. All right. If there's nothing else, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Okay, second.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Didn't think so. Thank you, one and all. till we meet again.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.